In addition, associated with these foreign currency shocks, Turkey had a very similar experience in the early part of this decade after 2001, because of these massive currency mismatches, because people had borrowed dollars and had domestic currency assets. When the currency collapsed, the banks were so comprehensively wiped out that the bailout costs turned out to be absolutely staggering. And in a number of cases, I've listed some of the bigger cases, we're talking about bailout costs of 20 to 50, 60% of GDP. So to put the number in American terms, 60% of GDP, I suppose, is about $8.5 trillion, just to bail out the insolvent financial system. So these were tremendous shocks. And a consequence of this, in my view, is that essentially pretty well every region of the emerging world, with the exception of Central and Eastern Europe, and Central and Eastern Europe was the exception because they really believed how foolish they were, as we can now see, that capital inflows would be safe in their case because it was part of the lead-up to integration in Europe. So they did go on with the sort of policies emerging countries had in the 80s and 90s, but nobody else did. Essentially, there were no more significant net borrowers in the emerging world. That was the first thing, and that's quite general. And in addition, there were a number of emerging countries, as I've mentioned, particularly in Asia, that became very, very large capital exporters. And this just shows at a very crude level the global balance of payments in this decade, and you can see that there was Japan as a consistent exporter. That's the yellow one. These are shares of world GDP. The Europeans were roughly in balance. At least the Eurozone was roughly in balance, neither absorbing nor exporting capital. And then there were two massive surplus regions. The Asians, predominantly China, but not only China, the countries hit by the crisis, and the oil exporters, of course, as a temporary boost in the more recent years. And until the housing bubble burst, and that was a decisive turning point for the US and for the world economy, the US was overwhelmingly the most important importer of this capital. In fact, if you look at it regionally, so you treat Europe as one entity, it looks rather different if you treat European countries as separate countries. If you treat Europe as one entity, the United States imported 70% of the surplus capital, the surplus savings of the entire world. And as I said before, nobody really imagined when we were liberalizing global capital flows that the net effect 25 years later was that the world's biggest and richest economy would become overwhelmingly the largest capital importer in the country. Another theme of my book is that all this didn't happen just by accident. It wasn't the result of pure market decisions, far from it. It was the result of conscious policies of government to keep their exchange rates down, to accumulate foreign exchange in official reserves, to sterilize these inflows. I won't go into all the monetary policy problems this creates, and to take the current account surpluses they were then earning and the very substantial capital inflows, which were also private capital inflows, which I won't show, don't have time to show the data for, take the whole lot and recycle them as official foreign currency reserves. The rise of the official foreign currency reserves of emerging countries in this decade has been a truly staggering phenomenon. Over the decade, as this chart shows, essentially between 1999 and early 2000, and the peak, the increase in the world's official foreign currency reserves, predominantly, though not entirely, US official liabilities, the GSEs, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and such institutions, the increase was $5.5 trillion. Incomparably, the largest official accumulation of capital, the largest capital outflow by governments. I refer to this when I joke about it as incomparably the largest official aid program in world history, from developing countries overwhelmingly to the United States. And as I said, it was $5.5 trillion. Of that $5.5 trillion, roughly close to 2, is China alone. But the remaining 3.5, there's about $0.5 trillion of Japan, and the other 3 is other developing countries. So this really was officially organized flows to accumulate foreign currency reserves, restrict and limit the risks of a currency appreciation, support export growth, and accumulate the reserves as insurance. And my own view in terms of the motivation of these policies is that it was a mixture which varied among countries between the desire to pursue export-oriented policy to support the export sector, very important, I think, in China, partly to preserve monetary stability by keeping the exchange rate fixed, but at a low level which they could sustain, so there was no risk of it being forced down, as had happened when they were capital importers, and finally to accumulate reserves as a form of insurance. And if you talk to emerging market economies today about their experience in the last crisis, all those that have accumulated these massive reserves are very grateful. They think it was a very good idea. So one way of thinking about this has been a pretty good trick for the US. It has essentially printed money. The world has purchased it, and it has raised the standard of living. However, it has been not without problems in the United States if we start looking at where this money all went. Where, in terms of national income, the flows all ended up. Very similar pictures emerged for UK and Spain. And there are lots of details I can't go into. But this chart really shows the core of the story for the US private sector. This shows the so-called financial balances, which are simply income and expenditure of different sectors of the economy. If you add up all the sectors of the economy, the government, the non-financial corporate sector, the corporate sector, the household sector, and the foreign sector, it must add up to zero by definition, because savings and investment must be equal at that level. But the really striking feature, I'm just going to focus on the last decade, you can see this rather clearly, is that the US household sector went up till the middle of this decade ever more increasingly into deficit. The point which, of course, the Levy Institute papers, co-authored by you and others, have made very often, Wynne Godley among them, the US household sector went ever more deeply into financial deficit. I spent ever more relative to income, peaking in the middle of this decade on these accounts which come from the national income and product accounts. That tendency, which is the same thing as saying that spending grew faster than income for the household sector, go back to the beginning of the 1990s, a very long-term process. The business sector, on the other hand, is a very different story. As you can see, it also moved into deficit in the late 1990s at the time of the stock market bubble. That then burst. This led to a massive adjustment, essentially in investment, which never recovered, and the business sector has been running a financial surplus for this decade, essentially continually. After the housing bubble burst in the United States, you will see that there was a massive and swift swing back into balance. This goes up to the third quarter, by the way, the data. I haven't yet done the fourth quarter of last year for these data. I don't think it's actually the fourth quarter. Is it available? I don't know, but I haven't looked. But the basic point is all that red line going back is essentially the household sector spending growing more slowly than its income. It's extracting demand from the economy, and it is, in my view, the principal reason why the US was first in a growth recession. Growth was slower than potential since 2006 and is now, with the present shocks, actually in recession. So the US household sector was the great borrower. If we aggregate it all and have the private sector, which is the households and business together, the government, and the foreign sector, which is, of course, providing capital, and I'm doing it such that they add up to zero, so it's a foreign capital inflow, you can see that in the peak, it was the government and the private sector were roughly absorbing this capital equally, and now that the private sector is going back to balance, since the foreigners are still lending money very freely to the United States, it's contracted a bit, the government deficit is exploding. And that is, in my view, I accept this analysis, the principal reason why the fiscal deficit this year is now expected to be, in the federal government sector, 12% of GDP. It's because of the combination of the massive cutbacks in the private sector with the continuing inflow of capital from abroad.